For more than 500 years, explorers have searched for a shortcut across the top of the world, a shipping route connecting Europe and Asia through the Arctic. Most of them failed. Hell, some of them died trying. For centuries, the reason was simple: ice. The Arctic Ocean was simply too frozen, too dangerous, and too unpredictable to become a major commercial shipping route. But something is changing. Today, ships are actually making that journey, and Russia is betting that one of the most inhospitable places on Earth could eventually become one of the most important shipping corridors. Hey, quick favor. I'm trying to get this channel to 5,000 subscribers as quick as possible. If you like what you're hearing, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, this isn't simply about Russia finding another way to move oil. It's about geography. Most of the trade between Europe and Asia currently depends on shipping routes thousands of miles to the south. I'm talking about through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. These routes have helped shape global trade for generations. But look at a globe instead of a flat map, and something becomes obvious. There is another way. Go north, across the top of Russia and through the Arctic Ocean. It's called the Northern Sea Route. And if Russia can turn it into a reliable commercial shipping corridor, one of the oldest dreams in maritime history could finally become reality, and the map of global trade could begin to change. So why would anyone want to ship through the Arctic? The answer becomes obvious when you look at the globe. A ship traveling between Northern Europe and East Asia sends that ship south, through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, and so on, through some of the busiest and most politically sensitive waterways on Earth. Then finally, into East Asia. The Northern Sea Route goes another direction. It goes along Russia's Arctic coastline and eventually through the Bering Strait into the Pacific. Depending on where the ship starts and where it's going, that can eliminate thousands of miles from the journey. For some voyages between Northern Europe and Northeast Asia, the Arctic route can be roughly a third shorter than traveling through the Suez Canal. And for Russian oil moving toward China today, the difference can mean roughly 2 weeks at sea. For a shipping company, 2 weeks is an eternity, and every additional day means fuel, crew cost, insurance, maintenance, and a ship that can't begin its next voyage. But there's another advantage that's becoming increasingly important. The Northern Sea Route avoids some of the most vulnerable shipping choke points. No Suez Canal, no Red Sea, no Bab el-Mandeb. And for cargo traveling between Russia and Asia, no need to sail through many of the European-controlled waters, where Russian ships and cargoes can face sanctions-related restrictions. That's particularly important today. The Red Sea has already shown the world what happens when one major shipping corridor becomes dangerous. Ships get rerouted, voyages get longer, fuel costs rise, insurance becomes more expensive, and suddenly a shipping route that once looked too difficult starts looking a little more attractive. That's the real opportunity Russia sees in the Arctic. Not necessarily replacing the Suez Canal, but creating another option. A shorter northern corridor connecting Russia, Europe, and Asia that doesn't depend on the same choke points the global economy has relied on for generations. But there is an enormous problem. You have to cross the Arctic Ocean. And the Arctic doesn't particularly care about your shipping schedule. So what's stopping the Northern Sea Route from becoming the next Suez Canal? Well, let's start with the obvious problem: ice. Yeah, it's frozen over quite a bit of the year. The Arctic may be becoming more navigable, but that doesn't mean it's becoming easy to navigate. Ice conditions can change quickly. A passage that's relatively clear one day can become far more difficult the next. Ships can encounter drifting ice, fog, extreme cold, unpredictable weather, and areas where reliable navigation information is much more limited than along established global shipping routes. And depending on the ship and the conditions, you may need something most shipping routes never have to think about: an icebreaker. Now, Russia operates the world's most capable fleet of heavy icebreakers, including nuclear-powered vessels specifically designed to keep Arctic shipping lanes open. But icebreakers cost money. Ice-class ships cost more to build and operate. Insurance becomes more complicated, and suddenly some of the money you saved up by taking the shorter route begins disappearing. Then there's infrastructure. Think about what happens when a container ship has a mechanical problem in the Mediterranean. There are ports, airports, repair facilities, hospitals, tugboats, rescue services, and other ships everywhere. Now, imagine having the same problem hundreds of miles from the nearest major settlement in the Arctic. There are enormous stretches of the Northern Sea Route where that infrastructure simply doesn't exist at anything approaching the scale of traditional shipping corridors. And then there's probably the biggest problem of all: reliability. Global shipping isn't built around finding the shortest route possible. It's built around knowing when your cargo is going to arrive. Factories schedule production around deliveries. Retailers manage inventory around shipping schedules. Ports schedule workers and equipment around expected arrivals. And a route that's incredibly fast one week and unpredictable the next can be less useful than a longer route that works reliably all year. And right now, the Northern Sea route is still overwhelmingly seasonal. Russia's trying to change that. It's building icebreakers, developing ports, improving ice monitoring, and pushing toward year-round navigation. But there's an enormous difference between proving that ships can cross the Arctic and building a global shipping system that companies can depend on every single week of the year. That's why the northern route isn't replacing Suez tomorrow. In fact, most of the world's biggest shipping companies still aren't using it. But that may not be the important question. Because Russia doesn't need the Arctic to replace the Suez Canal for the Northern Sea route to matter. It just needs enough ships and enough countries to decide that having another route is worth the cost. And one country is becoming particularly interested, China. So why does China care about a shipping route thousands of miles from its own borders? Because China has a problem. China is one of the largest trading nations on Earth. In fact, it is the largest. Its economy depends on ships moving enormous amounts of energy, raw materials, and manufactured goods around the world. And much of that trade has to pass through a surprisingly small number of choke points: the Strait of Malacca, the Indian Ocean, Bab el-Mandeb. Those three names keep popping up. If any one of those routes becomes disrupted, China's supply chains can become more expensive and more vulnerable. The Arctic offers another option, and China has been thinking about that possibility for years. Beijing has promoted what it calls the Polar Silk Road, an Arctic extension of the larger Belt and Road strategy. The idea is relatively simple: develop new shipping routes and economic connections across the Arctic, linking China with Russia and eventually Europe. And now we're beginning to see what that could actually look like. A Chinese shipping company is attempting to establish regular seasonal container service between China and Europe through Russia's Northern Sea route. Instead of sailing south through the Straits of Malacca, through the Red Sea, and through the Suez, those ships can head north across the Arctic, along Russia, and into northern Europe. For certain routes, the journey can be dramatically shorter. But there's something even more important happening here. China and Russia have things the other side needs. Russia controls most of the coastline along the Northern Sea route. It has Arctic ports, natural resources, and the world's most capable fleet of heavy icebreakers. China has something Russia desperately needs: trade, cargo, investment, ships, and one of the largest manufacturing economies in the world. Put those two things together, and the Northern Sea route starts becoming more than simply a Russian shipping project. It becomes a potential Russia-Chinese economic corridor. Russia can move oil, natural gas, and other resources east toward Asian customers. China can move manufactured goods west towards Europe. And both countries gain another transportation route that reduces their dependence on some of the traditional maritime choke points. That doesn't mean China is about to abandon the Suez Canal. It won't. The Arctic route remains seasonal, difficult, expensive, and tiny compared with the established shipping lanes further south. But that's not necessarily the point. China doesn't need the Northern Sea route to replace Suez. It needs to provide another option, because in geopolitics, having two routes is always better than depending on one. What happens if the Arctic really opens? This is where the story becomes much bigger than Russia and China. Because if the Arctic becomes increasingly accessible, it doesn't simply create another shipping route. It changes the strategic importance of an entire region. For most of modern history, the Arctic Ocean acted almost like a giant frozen wall. Russia sat on one side, the United States and Canada on another, Northern Europe sat between them, but commercial shipping through the region remained relatively limited. A more accessible Arctic changes that geography. Suddenly, ports that once seemed incredibly remote become more important. Shipping lanes become strategically valuable. Energy deposits become easier to reach, and mineral resources become more attractive. That's when countries begin to care a lot more about who controls the Arctic. Russia already understands this. It has invested heavily in Arctic military bases, ports, radar systems, airfields, and icebreakers. China understands it as well. Even though China isn't an Arctic country, Beijing increasingly views the region as strategically important to its future trade and energy security. And the United States and its allies are paying attention. The United States has Alaska. Canada controls an enormous Arctic coastline, and with Finland and Sweden now members of NATO, 7 of the 8 Arctic states are NATO members. Russia is the only exception. That creates an extraordinary geography. On one side, Russia controls the coastline along most of the Northern Sea route. On the other, almost every other Arctic country belongs to the same military alliance. And now China is becoming increasingly involved economically. That doesn't mean there's going to be a war over the Arctic. But it does mean the Arctic is becoming another place where economics, geography, resources, and military power increasingly overlap. Then there's another force pushing all this forward. The Arctic itself is changing. Sea ice has declined dramatically over the past several decades. That doesn't mean the Arctic is suddenly ice-free. It isn't. And it doesn't mean Arctic shipping will ever be easy. But longer periods of navigable water gradually change the economics of shipping in the region. More ships make the voyage, more infrastructure gets built. More money gets invested, and eventually something that once seemed impossible can start becoming normal. That's how geography changes, not overnight, but one ship, one port, and one investment at a time. The Northern Sea Route may never replace the Suez Canal. It probably doesn't have to. If it becomes reliable enough to carry even a meaningful portion of trade between Russia, Asia, and Europe, it creates something the global economy values enormously, another option. And that's why what's happening at the top of the world matters. For centuries, the Arctic was something ships tried to avoid. In the future, it may become somewhere they deliberately go to. And if that happens, one of the world's greatest geographic barriers could become one of its newest highways. Hey, this is Frank with America's Geopolitics. If you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.